Before we start the show, I'd like to ask you to please hit that subscribe or follow button. Your support is what fuels this podcast and provides the impetus to grow the show. It helps us book guests to tell their wild and funny career stories and also provide insight into the future of their industry. And here's the magic part. For every new subscriber we get, a unicorn is born somewhere in Australia, which means in the not too distant future, Netflix will be live streaming a unicorn versus kangaroo boxing match. If you want to see such a spectacle, please hit that subscribe button. And while you're at it, please go ahead and rate this podcast too. I'm not saying you should rate it 5 stars, but I am saying the number of stars you give this podcast should reflect the number of days in the work week. And now, on to the show.
I first knew about this journey when I was 6 years old, when my father announced over breakfast one morning that he wanted to sail around the world. And his reason was that he wanted to celebrate Captain Cook's third voyage. And the idea was that we would set sail on the 200th anniversary of that voyage. And that is what we did. So in July 1976, we set sail from the UK, embarking on this 3-year voyage around the world.
Welcome to the Career Circus, the story night podcast that uncovers crazy career stories. The stories that you tell your friends over drinks that are just too wild, too funny, or too awkward to keep to yourself. This podcast is where we bring these stories to life. Each week, we are joined by esteemed guests, champions from the realms of politics, commerce, governance, sports, and media, who are bold enough to recount their most unbelievable feats and fumbles. From surprising stumbles to hilarious misunderstandings, we venture forth to explore the lighter, stranger side of one's professional quest. So get ready to be shocked and tickled, because this is where career paths get truly entertaining. And today we're very lucky to be joined by nobility. Lady Suzanne Heywood is COO of Exor, a holding company that has investments in Stellantis, Ferrari, Juventus Football Club, and the Economist newspaper. She's also the chair of CNH Industrial and Iveco Group and holds board positions for the Economist, Christian Louboutin, and is a director at the Royal Opera House in London. In addition, she's the best-selling author of What Does Jeremy Think? And Wave Walker, which chronicled her decade-long journey as a child, sailing around the world with her family, an experience which motivated her to educate herself. She was appointed Commander of the British Empire by King Charles in 2024, and she joins us now from London. Lady Heywood, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. Do call me Suzanne, and I'm delighted to be here.
Well, thank you very much, Suzanne. And typically on this podcast, we unpack crazy career stories, but I don't think we should start there because your childhood story is so unique, inspiring, daunting outside looking in, because was supposed to be a 3-year journey where you're sailing around the world with a family. It became a decade long. What was the impetus for that journey and how quickly did you tire of it?
So really, I first knew about this journey when I was 6 years old, when my father announced over breakfast one morning that he wanted to sail around the world. And his reason for wanting to sail around the world, as he explained it to me, was that he wanted to celebrate Captain Cook. And I should explain here that my maiden name is Cook, although it turns out that we're not related to Captain Cook. But he was a big admirer of Captain Cook, and he wanted to celebrate Captain Cook's third voyage. And the idea was that we would set sail on the 200th anniversary of that voyage. And that is what we did. So in July 1976, we set sail from the UK, embarking on this 3-year voyage around the world. And you asked me, what point did I start to tire of this? And really, my first indication that this was not going to be the exciting adventure that my father had promised was after we'd sailed from the UK down to South America, which, by the way, is a very long voyage. It's about 6-7 weeks at sea. And then all the way from South America to South Africa. And I should explain here to your listeners, if they're not sailors, that we were sailing the wrong way around the world, something I didn't understand as a child. But the normal way to sail around the world is that you sail from east to west. However, we were sailing from west to east. And the reason for that was that that was the way that Captain Cook went, because he went the other way around the world. Now, the problem with sailing the wrong way around the world is that you're sailing into the wind unless you go very, very, very far south. And that's what we did. So we were sailing across the very southern Atlantic Ocean from South America to South Africa. And then we set sail across the very southern Indian Ocean, which is one of the most dangerous oceans in the world. And halfway across that, we were shipwrecked. We were hit by an enormous wave, which was 3 times higher than our main mast, so 90 foot high. It smashed through the deck, out through the side of the boat, and I was flung against the ceiling of the main cabin. I was standing down below in the galley or kitchen and against the side of the hull. I broke my skull, broken nose, and so on and so on. And we ended up shipwrecked on this tiny little atoll in the middle of the Indian Ocean. I bet not all of your podcasts start like this, by the way, but there we go. We ended up shipwrecked on this tiny atoll in the middle of the Indian Ocean called Isle Amsterdam, which turns out to have a very small French scientific base on it. Luckily, there was a doctor there, very small kind of group of basically male French scientists, all men. And he operated on me because I had a blood clot on the brain and it was threatening kind of brain damage. And I ended up having 7 operations. But sadly, given that I was shipwrecked on an island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, no anesthetic. They didn't have any suitable anesthetic. So 7 head operations with no anesthetic. And you can just imagine, kind of screaming kind of pain. And my mother, and this, I think, even then there was a kind of, this struck me as very odd. She refused to join me for any of these operations. So I went through all of them on my own. And I think that was the moment where everything started to kind of turn. Now, not completely, because I'm still a small child. I'm still only 7 years old. I'm still with my parents. You've got no options in life. You're kind of with your parents at that stage in your life. And to some extent, you have to trust them. But a lot of the trust was gone. I mean, I no longer believed that this was going to be a safe adventure and that they were going to kind of care for me. So that was 1 year into this voyage.
So incredibly moving. Just hearing about it, it sounds incredibly traumatic, especially when you add the fact that you're 7 and you don't have agency and there's no anesthetic. It's quite moving and powerful. When that happened, did your parents reflect on the journey and reflect on the trauma and the physical impact it was having on you and think, you know what, maybe this isn't such a good idea, it's time to go home? Or did they think, let's just soldier on?
So to my knowledge, they never did. So what happened was my father was just very determined to get the boat repaired and then to continue this voyage. The French and the British government refused to let my mother, my brother and I get back on board the boat because they said it was too badly damaged. So my father sailed the boat to Australia. We had 2 crew members on board at the time and they sailed with him. And my mother, my brother and I, after a few more weeks, we were rescued by a passing cargo ship and we were taken to Australia and we reunited with my father in Fremantle, Western Australia. And then we spent about a year while my father repaired the boat. And I actually managed to go to school for a bit that year, which was wonderful. I never remember my father talking about stopping, regretting the fact that we'd been put in that position. And in fact, he later wrote a book about that first year and a half of our voyage. And when I read that book, it also surprised me because there's no sense in there of any sort of kind of regret. This was just something the world did to him. He was a hero because we didn't in the end sink and we got to the island. But there was no kind of sense of regret about it. In fact, my father later gave an interview to the papers where he said that actually I got off lightly in the accident. But actually, I had a fractured skull and a broken nose. I mean, I almost ended up with kind of brain damage. So he was very much of the kind of, the sort of adventurer who really is completely focused on the adventure, not really focused on the kids he's dragging along with him or the kind of impact on them.
Do you think that was a reflection of him or his generation or being British and trying to link this to Captain Cook, a legendary English explorer? Imagine it might be kind of a combination of the 3.
Yeah, I think it's certainly due to 2 things. First of all, I was born 69, so we're in the 1970s, kind of coming up to the late 1970s, and definitely kind of parenting in that time was very different to parenting now. Parents were much more dismissive of children's needs and much more focused on their own needs. And that obviously has kind of swung some might say too far the other way now, but certainly we're in a very different kind of generation of parents. However, I have to say, having compared my experience to other children of 70s parents, mine were at the extreme end. I mean, not many 70s parents were putting their children at kind of mortal risk, living on a boat, often with very little food, because we would regularly run out of food. Sometimes we would be running out of water. I mean, most, and no proper provision for schooling or friendships or anything like that. So my parents were off the spectrum even by that generation, but that generation, obviously, that's part of it. I think the other thing is there is a particular sort of person who does something like this. And I've heard it say that if you look at many adventurers who've achieved incredible things, they are amazing people, but you really wouldn't want to be related to them. I mean, even Captain Cook himself abandoned his family effectively in England, barely ever saw his children, and just kept on going back to sea. So there is something about the sort of person who does this and the sort of mindset that takes. And I think those two factors, when you put that together, perhaps, I'm not sure it forgives how my parents behave, but it certainly explains a little bit of it.
Yes, of course. Yeah, and it sounds quite alien and some ways horrific, that kind of approach to parenting. But at the same time, as you mentioned, it was a very different time. And you also mentioned that you ended up in Western Australia and went to school there. That must have been incredibly cathartic for you, somebody who was craving contact with people who aren't just your nuclear family. Then you're in a school setting. How long did that last, and how much did you enjoy it and felt like this is normal life? I'm so happy to be part of normal life.
Yeah, I loved it. I mean, I didn't go to school for very long there. It was about 9 months or so to a little primary school in Fremantle. I mean, I loved it. I just loved being with other kids. I was always quite an academic child. I was quite an academic child before we left England. So I loved being in a situation where I could learn things. On the boat, I was very limited in what I could learn. I could read every book that we had on board. My mother would occasionally produce a kind of worksheet, but that was relatively rare. So I was craving schooling, odd as it sounds. I was also craving friendship and all the things that you would take for granted in a childhood. So I did enjoy that, but I also knew it wasn't going to last very long, because my father was very clear that we were going to keep sailing. So this was a very transient period. I knew it was highly likely that the friends I was making I would never see again.
That's quite sad, especially because you're enjoying this, but at the same time you have that knowledge of the transient nature of that period in Fremantle. But while you were there, I imagine you were thrilled to be able to access books. What kind of books did you read when you were in Western Australia, but also at sea? Because when you're at sea, there's no library, but you've got a handful of books that are really carrying you and allowing you to dip into your imagination. Was it in Blighton? What kind of books? What captured your imagination back then?
On the boat, we didn't have very many books because we didn't have very much space on a boat. So we had a few books, but not very many. I remember when we first left England, we were on the, relatively early readers' books. But I was a voracious reader. So we also had some of the kind of the classics, like the, Emma and all of those kind of classic books, quite a lot of the Dickens books and so on, which I definitely got onto reading later. A lot of the time on board, the main books that we had was we had a small bookshelf in the main cabin down below that had space for about 20 books. That was about it. And every time we got to port, my mother would go and take those books and go to the local charity shop and give the 20 books to the charity shop and take 20 back. And so it was whatever the charity shop had. As you can imagine, it was a pretty heavy diet of Mills and Boons, kind of cheap detective stories, etc., etc. But, as time went on, I just read everything, because you didn't have any choice. And it was one way of getting a window into the world. Now, in all of that, there were some books that really kind of cut through. At some point I read The Diary of Anne Frank, which was incredible. I know it's kind of, probably everybody says that, but it really did. And although my situation was completely different to hers, and in many ways I shouldn't compare it, and, she was under mortal threat in a way that I wasn't, that feeling of being very trapped in a very small space with your family, and in my case with a particularly difficult mother, I really kind of felt for that. And there was another book I read, and I've forgotten her name. It's the girl who was deaf and dumb, and she wrote her biography. It's an extraordinary book. I think she was called Heidi. And that, again, really resonated with me. I remember reading it in South Africa because in a different sort of way, she was trapped in a very limited world.
Yeah, of course. So very relatable. As you went through these experiences and when you were onshore, South Africa, Western Australia, or otherwise, did you get a sense of what you were going through was so unique? And did you feel that that was a superpower that helped you stand out or connect with people? Or were you too young to be aware of that at the time?
So I did think what I was going through was very unusual. But to be quite honest, as a child, I hated that. I mean, what children want, and this is why, it's one of the things that I'm kind of trying to advocate for now, is to try and get people to understand that the mindset of a child is very different to the mindset of an adult. If you're an adult and you choose to do an extraordinary adventure, that is something that you can kind of boast about. It's something that you want to do. It's something that you've got you've got autonomy to make a decision about and do. You've chosen to do that in your life. As a child, first of all, you haven't chosen to do it. And also children, by and large, have a great desire to be normal. I mean, many of your listeners will know even a small amount of being different as a child will lead you to being kind of outcast from a group or mocked by other children. So imagine being so strange that every time you meet another child, they just think that you're weird. It's not a fun experience, actually. Certainly, what did not seem to me at the time in any way to be a superpower. I did later discover that there were elements of this childhood that became a superpower for me, but I certainly didn't perceive that as a child. My experience was more that I would meet other kids, and first of all, it would be quite hard to make friends, and then when I did make friends, we inevitably just left again. So they were very kind of short-term friendships. As I got older, I started to try and preserve those friendships by creating pen pals. But pen pals can never replace actually having a friend to sit down and talk to or go and do something fun with, particularly because we never had an address. So it was always very irregular, sending letters and getting letters back.
Of course. But since you've gone through this experience, you've written books, so you've got something of a public profile, not just through books, but through your work for Extra or otherwise. Has that led to some of the folks that you went to school with to reach out to you and try to revive the relationship at all?
So I kept in quite good touch with, later on in the story, we went all the way up to Hawaii and then we turned back down the South Pacific. And that was a kind of key moment, by the way, just to digress for one moment, because we had a vote. And my father had promised that if the vote was that we would come back to the UK, and he'd always said that the voyage would be 3 years, if we voted then to come back, so the voyage would have been 4 years because of the shipwreck, he would obey that. And if we voted to keep going, we would keep going. And my brother and I voted to come home because both of us wanted to come back to a more normal life. I was desperate to go to school. I wanted friends, all the rest of it. And my relationship with my mother on board this boat was deteriorating massively. And my parents both voted to keep sailing, and my father overrode the vote and said, no, we will keep sailing. And so we did. From that point onwards, and I was about 11 or 12, I was basically on the boat against my will. So when we got back to Australia, having sailed all the way back down the Pacific, I had about a year in a school in Australia, and I made a couple of friends there who I still am in touch with. So I definitely kind of kept in touch with them. What's happened since the book came out is a couple of things. One is quite a few of the crew who came on board the boat from time to time have reached out to me. Because what happened in the later years on the boat, and I was on the boat in the end for 10 years, most of my childhood, we ran completely out of money. And my father started chartering the boat and paying crew on board as a way of earning money. And my job was to cook and clean. I mean, I really was unpaid labor on the boat. And therefore, my parents, by the way, were not very keen on me studying because that was distracting me from cooking and cleaning and doing all the things that they wanted me to do. But various of these crew have reached out to me since the book came out, which has been very helpful. Often they've had kind of photos or memories from the voyage, so that's interesting. What's been even more interesting is that since Wave Walker, the book came out, and it's done so well because it's become a bestseller internationally, amazingly, a lot of people have reached out who also had extraordinary childhoods. Now, these childhoods are very, all sorts of different stories, from somebody who was dragged across Africa and then dragged across Australia by a father who was obsessed by mistletoe, believe it or not. I didn't even know it grew all the way across Africa, but it turns out it does. To obviously a lot of kids who grew up on boats. And that has been really interesting because although I haven't found anybody who had the same experience as me, I've now discovered people with very interesting but different versions of this story. And in fact, I'm in the process now of writing my next book, which is going to tell some more of these stories because some of these stories are really quite extraordinary.
Wow. Well, thank you for doing that because in many ways, truth is stranger than fiction. And there's so many extraordinary stories out there and that lead to extraordinary, resilient people. So thank you for sharing the spotlight with those people. Now, what I find so remarkable about your story is that you underwent such profound challenges. You had no support for an education, which you craved, but you persevered. You found a way to educate yourself to the point where you admitted to university back in Britain. But not just university. If you went to any university in Britain, that would have been a great achievement. But you didn't just do that. You got admitted to Oxford, arguably the world's finest university at the time, and even now. So it's an incredible achievement. So I'm full of admiration. What was it like when you got back to Oxford? Was it like, oh my God, I'm finally on land. I'm back in Britain. I'm never leaving. Because I partly asked that because I spent 10 years in the US. When I moved back to Britain, I was like, I'm never leaving this country. I love it so much. Did you undergo something like that where you're like, finally, I get to live life on my own terms and this is amazing?
So when I got back and I started at Oxford, what I anticipated was that academically it was going to be really, really difficult because, as you say, then and now Oxford is one of the best universities in the world, and I was expecting that I was going to be at a massive academic disadvantage to everybody else because I barely been to a proper school. I was largely self-taught. I'd done correspondence courses on the boat, but without kind of access to regular teachers or access to a library or access to a science lab or anything like that. And then I couldn't wait for the social side of going to university because I'd basically grown up without being able to have regular friendships. What I found when I went to university was actually oddly the other way around. I mean, academically there were, and actually I'm still conscious there are kind of holes in my education. But the one thing that I learned on this boat was how to teach myself. And so the education that was available there, I just, absorbed it. I mean, I couldn't believe how wonderful lectures were. I know this sounds ridiculous, but I remember going in and sitting in a lecture and thinking, this is bizarre. I have somebody in front of me telling me all this stuff in a very kind of entertaining way. I'm going to write it all down and remember it, though why wouldn't I remember it? And then they're going to give me an exam on it. I mean, it's got to be more difficult than that somehow. I'm just used to trying to kind of pull information out of a, single textbook, reading it 100 times to try and work out what it means. Academically, actually, I worked hard, but that's what I was used to doing. I was used to working kind of hard on that, and I was absolutely fine. Academically, it was not a problem. Socially, it was really difficult. That was the shock. I found it really difficult to make friends. They thought I was really weird. I thought they were really weird. In retrospect, I think we were both right. I remember at one point, which is a kind of incident that maybe kind of sums up the whole problem. I remember one of the other girls and I ended up at an all-women's college, which was in some ways probably a mistake, but I left my application form blank when I applied to Oxford, and that's where I was allocated to. And my logic there was very sound, which was I don't care what college I go to. I just want to go to university. But it did mean that I ended up in a kind of college which was all women, which was also quite difficult to kind of adjust to after my kind of background. And this other girl saying to me, Suzanne, you're the worst person at small talk that I've ever met. And the interesting thing about this is at the time, what I thought was, I don't know why I should be care about that at all. Why would I want to do small talk? I've spent a decade on a boat, desperate to get out and have proper conversations with people. Why do I want to talk small talk? And of course, now I look back and I think, well, it says something about her maturity that she would say that to me and not understand my background at all or want to understand why I was like that. But it says almost more about me that I didn't understand the social skills that you need and the importance of things like small talk and getting to know somebody. So that was really difficult when I first came back. And it took me I would say the best part of my first year to really learn those skills and to start to make really good friendships. It was not helped by the fact that my parents disowned me in my second term at Oxford. Um, my parents have always been very difficult about money, so they, you know, decided it was going to be cheaper if they didn't pay anything for me to be at university, so they disowned me. And that was very difficult because I was too scared to tell my college that I was disowned. And therefore, I took to trying to survive on not very much money until I finally went and saw them towards the end of my second year because I had to, because I was by that point very hungry. So that didn't help socially either. But in the end, all of that worked out. I ended up with a really good degree. I ended up with some very good friendships from Oxford. Oxford and my college did me a huge service in letting me in because it completely turned my life around. So I just can't kind of thank them enough for that. But then back to your question about whether when I got back, did I think, well, I will never leave? Well, yes and no. I mean, it was a real shock coming back to the UK. Grown up basically in the South Pacific. And now I was in a cold and quite grey country where I didn't really know anybody. I went to go and see my relatives, but of course my relatives had not seen me since I was 7 years old, so I didn't have any great closeness with any of my relatives. So I had that kind of odd feeling of, I'm now back in the country, which is my country, but it also doesn't feel like home. Now, over time, it has grown to feel a lot more like home, but I still love to travel. And I actually think, back to the earlier part of our conversation, that the fact that I've always felt a little bit of an outsider kind of everywhere. I mean, the only place where I don't feel an outsider is if I get back on a boat and go out to sea, which I occasionally do. And suddenly I'm in my element. I mean, that is home. That is where I grew up. And I know it and I can feel it, but I don't want to live there. So that's home, but I know it's not where I want to be. But there's a huge advantage in being an outsider because, first of all, you, as I was saying kind of earlier, you have much more of an ability to challenge the system. And I came out of my childhood with an understanding of multiple different countries and cultures. So, for example, we lived for about a year and a half in Hawaii, so I have a very good understanding of American culture from that because there's something about experiencing it as a child that you can't kind of get later in life. We spent a long time in New Caledonia, Tahiti, so I have quite a lot of French inside my head. So there's a lot of things that come from that nomadic lifestyle, which turned out to be quite helpful if you can escape from that background.
We'll be back with more with Suzanne right after this quick break. OpenAI is paying around $400,000 per year for someone to work on storytelling and communications because they know in a world awash in AI-generated content, authentic storytelling is needed to cut through the noise and convert hearts and minds. Don't take my word for it. Listen to investor and entrepreneur Keith Richman, who posted about this on LinkedIn. According to Keith, all matters is the ability to connect with people through narrative. AI can generate infinite amounts of content, but cannot create genuine human connection. It can mimic tone and style, but cannot share real experiences or build an authentic community. The better AI gets at producing content, the more valuable human perspective becomes. Now, you may not have $400K to invest in comms if you're an executive trying to position yourself as a thought leader, or an athlete trying to reinvent yourself for a post-playing career, or a startup trying to gain investment. But you don't need that kind of budget. What you need is Story Night, an independent strategic comms firm that applies the talents of award-winning Hollywood writers to your communications and marketing. Story Night will help you leverage talent that has written for hit shows on Netflix, Disney+, NBC, CBS, and more to write your newsletters, speeches, memoirs, decks, and more. To learn more, visit the Story Night website at story-night.com. And now, back to the show. The nice thing about your story is that you were able to escape, turn your life around, as you said, and now you've got executive positions and sit on many boards. Have your experiences as a child in Hawaii, in South Africa, South America, etc., are there any examples where this truly unique perspective you've gained has helped you in your professional pursuits?
Yes, no, absolutely. I think understanding different cultures and the sorts of people who come out of different cultures is really helpful in executive positions because, for example, I'm very familiar with the American style. What it means when Americans tend to be much more kind of positive verbally than the Brits. They tend to be much more exaggerated in their pleasure about things, which, by the way, I think they're both kind of great traits, but you need to have that kind of translation going on in your head so that you can calibrate appropriately. And that kind of comes automatically in that I'm very familiar with that culture. Likewise, when I later went on and I was working in McKinsey, I had clients in Australia and I kind of understood the Australian culture, felt quite comfortable in the Australian culture. I had a client in South Africa. I knew South Africa. So that it is very useful to be comfortable in multiple different cultures. And indeed, because I grew up a lot in the South Pacific, which at the time was very poor, I'm also quite comfortable going to countries which are really very different in terms of the living standards to what we enjoy in the UK. So that I think is all very helpful. But almost the kind of biggest benefit I find in my executive career is because, there's actually quite a lot of evidence that the people who escape from these very difficult childhoods, if they escape, and by the way, the vast majority of people don't, but about 3/4 never do, basically. 3/4 when you do longitudinal studies of children who've come from very difficult childhoods are permanently impacted in terms of their personal relationships and their career trajectory. But 1/4, on average, escape and end up having what looks like kind of normal relationships and normal career trajectory. We don't quite know why that is. There's a bit of a hypothesis that maybe it's that those children are better at forming relationships, and so they manage in even quite difficult circumstances to form relationships. But what's also interesting is a second piece of research that shows that set of people who escape from very difficult childhoods often go on to very senior positions. And of course, it only takes a moment for us to think about some examples. One very obvious one is Elon Musk. Very obvious one. But also, I remember there was a study of British prime ministers, and you'd be surprised how many came from really quite chaotic and difficult childhoods. For example, Boris Johnson. So if you put that together, you ask yourself, what is it that allows the people who escape from those very difficult childhoods to do so well? And for me, what it is that it enables you to put things into perspective. So when, for example, I had to step in at very short notice to be CEO of Case New Holland, C&H, and I did that in March 2020 during the COVID crisis with literally 1 day's notice. And it was a very difficult time, as you can imagine. It's a big company, and it was a much bigger company then because we since spun Iveco Group out. But at the time, it was about 70,000 employees with plants all over the world. And we were closing all those plants because of COVID and then trying to work out when we would bring them back up. We were very worried about our financing. We were worried about our liquidity. All sorts of things were going on. I was able, and this sounds kind of ridiculous, but it is actually true. When I started to kind of panic a little bit about all the things that we had to decide and the kind of the magnitude of some of these decisions, I was able to say, wait a moment, just remember what it was like to be a tiny little girl sitting on a boat in the middle of the Indian Ocean with no autonomy, in serious kind of physical jeopardy. That's bad. Okay? You are now, you're not completely in control, but you have a lot of control. You're not in immediate physical jeopardy. You need to listen to the people around you and take the best possible decision that you can do. And that calmed me down. And what I discovered is you almost always, if you listen carefully to the people around you, there's a lot of people who together collectively you'll be able to work out a way through. And indeed we did. And during that period when I was kind of CEO, we took the company from really quite a difficult position in March 2020 to a much stronger position in kind of January 2021. Share price kind of doubled over that period. And the new CEO came in and we were in a much better place. That, for me, the knowledge of different cultures is a huge asset, but that ability to put life in perspective is a huge asset from a difficult childhood.
Yeah, and that's amazing because what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And despite the immense challenges you've described today, but also in the book, it's made you stronger, resilient, unfazed by anything. There's a confidence that I can do this. because I've seen it all. So that really stands out. And for your services to business, you were appointed commander of the British Empire by King Charles not long ago. How did you feel about the news, and what's it like to go to the palace to get this award from the king? Was it the king who gave the award, or was it somebody else in his stead?
It was actually Prince William, which was lovely. And I went to Windsor Castle, and it was a lovely day for a couple of reasons. One is I was able to take all of my 3 children with me, so that was wonderful. I have 3 children. Sadly, I'm widowed, so my husband was not there, but all my 3 children were able to go with me, which was absolutely wonderful. And Prince William remembers my husband. So my husband, Jeremy Heywood, was cabinet secretary here in the UK, worked very closely with 4 different British prime ministers. I actually wrote his biography as well. What does Jeremy think? Because he had an incredible career, which unfortunately was cut short by lung cancer. He died in 2018. But that day at kind of Windsor Castle, because it felt like I was kind of completing a little bit of a circle for him. And also I was able to go with my 3 children, was really wonderful.
And through marriage and through your own career working at the Treasury early in your career, you've been in around government a little bit. Anything that stands out from that time? Is it anything like Westminster or House of Cards? I mean, the original House of Cards, the British version. Any truth is stranger than fiction moments from your time in and around government?
Well, as you say, I've had quite a lot to do with government. After I did my degree, I did a PhD, and then I worked in the Treasury for a few years, which is where I met my now late husband, Jeremy. And then Jeremy and I were married for over 20 years, during which time he became very senior in the civil service and then worked for multiple different prime ministers. And actually, since he passed away, I created something called the Heywood Foundation in his memory, which is dedicated to promoting innovation in public policy. So we sponsor senior civil servants to go up to the Blavatnik School in Oxford and think about long-term public policy issues. And we also publish a quarterly magazine called the Heywood Quarterly, which is freely available online for people to read. And so through those things, I now remain still very closely in touch with the civil service, and I have many friends in the civil service and many people, of course, who worked with Jeremy as well. I mean, the answer is that, I've always thought that in the thick of it is a little bit closer, but obviously wildly exaggerated with quite a lot more swearing, to what Whitehall is like than Yes Minister. Yes Minister, absolutely brilliant television series, one of Jeremy's favourites, I should add, but it misportrayed Whitehall because the civil service doesn't try to take advantage of ministers. I mean, that's the kind of thesis behind kind of Yes Minister. And that's not really true. The reason why I always quite liked kind of In the Thick of It was it portrays a little bit the chaos of the very centre of government, because the very centre of government, unlike the departments and the, kind of non-departmental public bodies, which are kind of busy getting on to the day-to-day job of kind of getting stuff done, right in the centre, you're incredibly battered by the news events that are going on, the individual crises, what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East, the fact that we've got, at the moment today, the government's dealing with a kind of migrant crisis. You're dealing with these events, so it feels incredibly kind of turbulent. And I tried to capture some of that in my book about Jeremy, because that's the real trick in the centre of government, is how you deal with those immediate crises the whole time, whilst also still trying to get the longer term stuff done. You've got to try and kind of balance the two. And there are many funny stories in Jeremy's book, partly because he had a rather cheeky sense of humour. Even in the most difficult moments, Jeremy would always have kind of quite a cheeky sense of humour. There's a great little story in there, for example, and it was when David Cameron was Prime Minister, and David Cameron wanted to break a piece of international law. I think it was the Convention on Human Rights. And Jeremy was going into a meeting with David Cameron and a whole bunch of special advisors to try to convince them not to, because, by the way, one of the rules of the civil service is you can't break the law. So his job was to try and kind of stop this happening. And he mused on his way in that he had as much chance of convincing them not to do it as he would have done if he'd tried to have the same conversation with the kind of people sitting in his local pub. They had absolutely no chance whatsoever, but he was going to give it a go. which indeed he did.
I think thanks for sharing that. I think the civil service is a hugely underrated part of what makes Britain work, especially because, as you mentioned, they're trying to balance short term and long term. And in many cases, not for a huge amount of pay. And we're living in a world where it's kind of going from crisis to crisis. You touched upon the Middle East, Ukraine. I would add the trade policy coming out of the US makes your head spin. And so these civil servants are having to react to tweets to then brief ministers to try and negotiate on our country's behalf. Final question. You've had this most incredible journey from at sea and now these professional achievements, Oxford, writing these books. At the risk of sounding sycophantic, I imagine you get this a lot, but I'm so full of admiration for your resilience, your story, your ability to tell these stories, because I imagine it must be very difficult. You touched upon, I was hearing you tell these stories. I didn't know about this disowning while you were at Oxford. And, if you just isolate to that one episode, even that is traumatic. That's very difficult. So I really admire your courage for sharing these stories. As you think about the entire arc of your career, and when I say career, I mean from the voyage up till now, what would you consider to be the moral of the story?
Wow. I don't know if I'm allowed to, but I was very conscious when I wrote Wave Walker that there were two kind of underlying morals coming out of this tale. Neither of which I made explicit in the book, by the way, but I felt that they were there. And I know that a lot of people have read the book have told me that they've kind of found them in there. One is a bit more negative and one is very positive. So the more negative one we slightly touched on earlier, which is that there is a real need for parents when they're going to kind of take their children out of the mainstream to balance their desires and their needs with those of their children, because they're not the same. And when you're making a decision as a parent, you're effectively making a decision. You're making a decision for your child because they don't have autonomy. And, we see, all over Instagram, pictures of kind of people kind of taking their kids out of school and walking along a lovely sandy beach and saying what wonderful parents they are. And I feel like saying to every single one of them, lovely, but just listen to your child and bear in mind that what's wonderful for you may not be wonderful for them and they don't have a voice. So that's kind of one moral, which I think kind of comes out, or big learning for me, and something which I'm very keen to keep on saying. And partly I keep on saying it because I'm conscious I'm going against the flow here. It looks lovely. The beach looks gorgeous, and the little kids walking with the parents looks gorgeous. How can anyone criticize that? But the reality is there's going to come a time, particularly when those kids are a little bit older and early teens, where the last thing in the world they want to be doing is walking along a beach with their parents. They're going to want to be hanging out with their friends and making relationships outside of the family and starting to build their own lives. So that's one thing. And then in a much more positive way, the huge moral that comes out of my story is how, the power of education to catapult you from one type of life into another. I mean, without education, and I'm not exaggerating, I would probably still be sitting uneducated in a boatyard doing some sort of manual job. Or I'd be a single mother sitting somewhere unemployed. I don't know what I would be, but I would be nowhere. And education, and it was kind of hard won at the time. And, one of my great, and I am an eternal optimist, by the way, but one of my great hopes of kind of AI is that we're making it easier for people in the sorts of situations that I was in to educate themselves, is education can catapult you from that into a completely different life trajectory. And that's what happened to me. And we need to try to make it still possible for that to happen. And the reason why I say that is because, going back and talking to my tutor at Oxford, the one who took a big bet on me and let me in, it is even harder now to do that than it used to be in the past.
Yes. And I think it also speaks to how sometimes you just need someone to take a bet on you, as that tutor at Oxford did, and help turn things around for you in a very dramatic way and propel you to everything that you've achieved since. This has been an utterly riveting conversation. I feel like we could go on and on and on, and I'd like to return to it in the not too distant future. But thank you so much for coming on the show, for sharing all these insights, for being so detailed. I've been really moved by what you've shared and very motivated as well. And so thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you. It's been wonderful to be here.
To get a breakdown of what made Suzanne's story so gripping, check out Story Night's newsletter, Deconstructing the Saga, at story-night.beehive.com. On the next episode, we'll hear from financier and entrepreneur Abbas Hashmi. Abbas operates at the intersection of private wealth and geographic mobility as a financial advisor to royal families and ultra-high net worth individuals globally. He also leads the program on family enterprises and wealth at Columbia University. Tune in to hear tales of Saudi mega projects, how to go about doing business in the Middle East, and the future of family wealth management. The episode drops next Friday. Until then, goodbye.